You are walking through a forest 40,000 years ago. The sun's going down, temperatures dropping. You can hear things moving in the darkness that you absolutely do not want to meet on their terms. And right there, carved into the hillside, is a cave, sheltered. Defensible, a ready-made fortress that required zero construction, zero maintenance, and has already been standing for 1,000,000 years before you were born, and will stand 1,000,000 years after you are gone. You walk in, you light a fire, you survive the night. Now imagine someone tells you, in a few generations, your descendants are going to abandon this. All of them. They're going to walk out of caves like this across the entire planet and never come back. You'd think they were insane, but that is exactly what happened. And here's the thing nobody tells you about why. We didn't leave caves because we got smarter. We didn't leave because we discovered architecture or developed some grand vision of civilization. We left because staying in the cave had become lethal. And the reason it became lethal reveals something deeply strange about what happens when a species that evolved in small groups suddenly has to figure out how to live in crowds. This isn't a story about progress. It is a story about population pressure, disease, territorial violence, and one of the most dramatic ecological transitions in the history of our species. Caves didn't stop working. We outgrew them. And that broke everything. Let's start with the obvious thing everyone gets wrong. The cave as perfect natural shelter. Fantasy. Yes, it blocks wind. Yes, it stays cool in summer, holds heat in winter. Yes, the entrance is a natural choke point you can defend with a handful of people. But caves are also dark. Profoundly, suffocatingly dark. 3 meters from the entrance. You can't see your hand. 10 meters in, you can't see anything, ever. The darkness is absolute. Which means if you want to live deep enough inside to escape predators, you need fire. Not for cooking, not for warmth, for seeing, fire, constantly. Every waking hour, for your entire life. And fire in an enclosed stone chamber creates a second problem that nobody thinks about until they're choking on it. Smoke. Smoke doesn't just irritate your lungs, it destroys them. Modern studies of populations still using cave dwellings in parts of China and Central Asia have documented chronic bronchitis in over 60% of adults. Partial blindness by age 40. Lung damage visible in skeletal remains, 30,000 years old. Even Neanderthals, who lived in European caves for hundreds of thousands of years, who were built for this, show the same pathological markers. Their skeletons are records of slow suffocation. You are not living in a cozy stone cottage. You are living in a dark chamber where every breath costs you a little bit of lung capacity. You'll never get back. But people lived there anyway, for hundreds of thousands of years. Because as bad as the cave was, the alternative was worse, until suddenly it wasn't. Here is the second problem. If caves are so great, why not just find more caves? Because you can't. Caves exist in very specific geological conditions, carved by water over millions of years through limestone and volcanic rock. If your region doesn't have the right geology, you don't get caves, period. And even where caves exist, a usable cave needs to be dry, accessible, large enough for a family group, defensible, and near water. Most caves fail at least one of these requirements. Most fail several, and the ones that meet all the requirements. Something else already lives there. Bears loved caves. Big cats loved caves. Hyenas loved caves. Wolves denned in caves. And every single one of these animals was significantly better at violence than an individual human with a wooden spear. When archaeologists excavate cave sites, they find something darkly funny. Layers of human occupation, then bear, then human again, then hyena, then human again. Then the bear comes back. It is the world's oldest timeshare dispute. Except instead of passive and aggressive notes about dirty dishes, the negotiation process involved teeth, claws. And whoever was willing to bleed more to stay. The cave wasn't anyone's home. It was a contested resource, and possession was determined by who was present and who was willing to fight. In a Lunumel square kilometer territory, you might find Wusher to Yalonun caves total. Maybe 1 to 5 meet all the requirements for actual habitation for a region supporting several human bands, plus all the predators with the same idea. The math was brutal before it even got started. Now we arrive at the real answer. Humans stopped living in caves, primarily because there were too many humans. A decent Zan-sized cave might comfortably shelter Shu to censure people. Maybe you could cram Wuxia in there if you really had to. But it would be tight, smoky, disease, Zen-ridden, and tense enough that someone's getting stabbed over a sleeping spot within a month. For most of human history, this worked. Small nomadic bands could use caves as seasonal shelters, move on when needed. The cave capacity matched the population size. Then something happened that changed everything. Around 1,000 years ago, the climate warmed. The Ice Age ended, and in a handful of regions scattered across the planet, humans figured out something that would reshape the species forever. Agriculture. 1 hectare of wild forest might support Linder Nini to Linder Ninwu, people through hunting and gathering. 1 hectare of farmed wheat can support Wu to Shu people. That is not Abafingerloon improvement. That is a Yaolinin to 10 times increase in the carrying capacity of the same piece of land. Let that number sit for a second. In the Fertile Crescent, population density estimates for hunters and gatherers around 1000 BC sit at roughly Linder Ni people per square kilometer. By Liu Chen BC, after the spread of farming, that number had increased to Shu to Wuxia people per square kilometer. A Yaolinin to Wubai tenfold increase in no 10 years, in a species that had spent the previous Arjodinin 10 years barely moving the needle. The same valley that sustained Senshishaushur, unturds and gatherers, was now supporting Senchen farmers. And there were still only 4 good caves. 4 caves that, even packed dangerously full, might shelter Arbai people, and you have Sensen. Math doesn't just stop working. It breaks catastrophically. You can't fit a farming village of Wubai people into a cave. It is not a matter of discomfort. It is literally, physically impossible. The transition wasn't cultural. The transition wasn't optional. The transition was forced by raw arithmetic. Here is what nobody tells you about the invention of architecture. It wasn't a creative leap. It was a survival response by desperate people who had no other choice. The oldest known human-built structures date back 20,000 years to sites along the Don River in Ukraine and the Malta settlements in Siberia. Hunter-gatherers tracking mammoth herds across open steppe with no forests, no hills, no rock outcroppings, and absolutely, definitively, no caves. Temperatures in winter dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Without shelter, you would be dead within hours. So they built from whatever was available. At the Mezhyrich site near Kiev, archaeologists excavated 4 structures built entirely from mammoth bones. Not wood, not stone. Bones. Each structure used roughly 95 mammoth skulls, jaws, and tusks, some weighing over 100 kilograms each. Total weight of bone. Per structure, over 20 tons. To build one of these, you need to kill or scavenge 15 to 30 mammoths. Transport tons of bone, some pieces requiring multiple people to carry. Figure out, through trial and fatal error, how to stack irregularly shaped bones into a framework that won't collapse under Siberian winter winds. This is not creativity. This is engineering under conditions where failure means your family freezes to death and the structures required constant maintenance. Bones shift, hides tear, wind finds gaps. You are not building a house and walking away. You are building a house and spending the rest of your life keeping it from falling apart. But here is the key insight that changed everything. You could build as many as you needed. 10 people. Build 1 hut. 100 people. Build 100. 1,000 people. Build 100. Caves can't do this. Cave capacity is fixed by geology. Human population is not. Constructed shelters introduced scalability into human housing for the first time. The limiting factor was no longer geology. It was labor and materials. And those could be expanded. Once agriculture made that scalability mandatory, construction went from niche adaptation to universal necessity. The cave system that had worked for 500,000 years simply could not scale to match agricultural population densities. The architectural revolution wasn't born from ambition. It was born from desperation. There is one more factor that nobody talks about, and it makes dense cave occupation not just impractical, but lethal. Caves are disease incubators. Epidemiologists call it the epidemic threshold, the minimum population size required for a disease to become self-sustaining, rather than burning itself out. For most human pathogens, that threshold sits around 200 to 500 people in sustained close contact. Hunter-gatherer bands were almost always below this threshold. Diseases flared, burned through the group, and disappeared. The next band was 50 kilometers away. Agriculture destroyed this protection permanently. Pack 200 agricultural villagers into a cave year. Round and disease dynamics change catastrophically. Human waste, 10 to 20 kilograms. Per Dalton Y, from 100 people, accumulates faster than it can be removed, seeping into water sources. Respiratory pathogens recirculate through air that never fully vents. Parasites spread through shared sleeping spaces. Domestic animals kept inside for winter warmth become vectors for zoonotic disease. The archaeological evidence documents this with disturbing clarity. At Tail Wineke, bioarchaeological analysis shows rib lesions, consistent with tuberculosis, in roughly 30% of adult skeletons. Chronic sinusitis in over 50%. Dental infection rates 3 to 4 times higher than in contemporary hunter-gatherer populations. These are diseases of crowding, diseases that cannot establish themselves in small mobile bands, but flourish in dense, permanent settlements. And caves, with their limited ventilation, fixed layouts that prevent sanitation engineering, and moisture that encourages bacterial growth, were the worst possible environment for dense permanent occupation. The Cave of the Treasure in Israel shows this transition directly. Layers showing successful small group seasonal use around 10,000 BC. Attempted dense agricultural occupation around 7,000 BC. Complete abandonment by 6,000 BC as the population moved to surface structures. Where waste could be managed, air could circulate, and water sources could be separated from living areas. They weren't leaving because they preferred surface dwellings. They were leaving because staying was killing them. We didn't leave caves for better housing. We left caves to stop dying. And then there was violence. A cave is a fixed geographic location. It cannot be moved. It cannot be hidden. If you live in a cave permanently, everyone within a day's walk knows exactly where you are, how many entrances you have, and how to find you in the dark. The defensive advantage of a cave, the narrow entrance that lets a few defenders hold off many attackers, only works against raiders, quick violent encounters where attackers want to loot and leave. Against a force willing to commit to a siege, the cave's greatest strength becomes its fatal weakness. You don't need to storm the entrance, you just need to control it, block it with stones and bodies. Post guards, wait, inside. You have no external water source unless the cave has an underground spring, which most don't. No food beyond what you've stored. No escape route. No way to remove smoke from your fires. 200 people, including children and elders, trapped in a sealed stone box with diminishing resources. Within days, no water. Within a week, starving. Within 2 weeks, smoke inhalation and disease from accumulated waste. Start killing the weakest. The besieging force loses nothing. They just wait. At the Hoa Feta cave in Libya, archaeologists found a mass burial of at least 13 individuals near the entrance, all killed violently, showing signs of malnutrition before death, suggesting a prolonged blockade before the final assault. At Sun Bua Cave in Vietnam, 23 individuals, men, women, and children, apparently killed during a siege, skeletal remains showing weeks of malnutrition before death. The pattern repeats globally as organized warfare intensified in the Neolithic period. Caves stopped being fortresses and started being traps. The populations that recognized this and moved to disperse surface settlements, where attackers had to divide forces, where defenders had multiple escape routes, where no single choke point could seal everyone's fate, survived. The cave went from humanity's first fortress to humanity's first obsolete military technology. Here is where the story takes a turn nobody expects. Humans didn't stop using caves, we stopped living in them. But we kept going into them, for completely different reasons. Starting around 40,000 years ago, precisely as humans began building surface dwellings, deep caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia became something else entirely. Not living spaces, sacred spaces. At Chauvet Cave in France, dated to 37,000 years ago. At Lascaux, 17,000 years ago. At Altamira, 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. And at hundreds of sites across every inhabited continent. These aren't caves near entrances where light reaches. These are deep chambers requiring crawling through narrow passages in total darkness for hundreds of meters. Passages where a wrong turn means you never find your way out. Chambers where the temperature drops, the air thins, and the silence becomes absolute. And on those walls, paintings. Horses, bison, predators, and human handprints, rendered in ochre and charcoal. Some on ceilings requiring scaffolding carried through those narrow passages in complete darkness. Archaeologists find no domestic debris in these deep chambers, no hearths, no food waste, no sleeping areas, just art, and the footprints of the people who risked their lives to make it. Why? Why crawl into a freezing, dark, dangerous labyrinth just to paint an animal that almost no one will ever see? Because the cave had become something different. It had become a portal. The surface was where you farmed, ate, raised children, and lived the mundane routines of agricultural life. The cave was where you went to leave the ordinary world behind, where the dead resided, where initiates were reborn, where shamans accessed knowledge unavailable in daylight. The same darkness that made caves unbearable for daily life made them perfect for ritual transformation. We didn't forget about caves. We promoted them. From shelter to sanctuary, from fortress to temple, from where you live to where you go when you need to touch something older than civilization. The cave art isn't decoration. It is memory. It is archaeology performed by the people who lived through the transition. It is them painting the animals they used to depend on in the one location that would never change, never erode, never be built over. The cave became humanity's first archive, and we're still reading it. Here is the uncomfortable truth. We left caves sheer, lean years ago. In evolutionary terms, that is nothing. Not nearly enough time for significant genetic change. Your brain and body are still optimized for cave dwelling. You just happen to be living in a world where caves are no longer available. This is why you still prefer sleeping with your back against a wall. Why bedrooms with closed doors feel safer than open-plan lofts. Why basements feel cozy despite being technically less safe than upper floors. Why the weighted blanket industry generates hundreds of millions of dollars by selling people the sensation of being enclosed and protected. We're still cave animals. We just don't have caves anymore. And every housing crisis you've ever heard about is an echo of the moment. The caves ran out. Too many people, not enough shelter. The only answer is construction. The person struggling to pay rent in a city with a housing shortage is experiencing the same fundamental pressure that forced your ancestors out of geological fortresses, Dafn years ago. Different materials, different scale, same math. Your apartment is not a luxury. It is not progress. It is a survival technology descended directly from those mammoth bone huts on the Siberian steppe, built by people who had no choice but to build, because the natural shelters could no longer contain them. The cave was free, permanent, geologically provided. It didn't require rent, mortgage, maintenance, utilities, or insurance. It would outlast you, your children, and your children's children. Constructed shelter requires continuous investment to exist, and that investment has never stopped. We've just institutionalized it into economic systems that make it seem normal. So why did ancient humans stop living in caves? Because there were too many of us. Because agriculture multiplied populations beyond anything cave capacity could support. Because the smoke that had always been uncomfortable became lethal when mixed with tuberculosis in crowds of 200, because the fortress that protected small bands became a tomb when besieging armies learned to simply block the entrance and wait. We didn't evolve past caves, we didn't outgrow them culturally. We outgrew them numerically. And once we did, there was no going back. Because here is the final piece. Once your population exceeds cave capacity, you can't collapse back down to caves in sustainable numbers without catastrophic dies and off. The agricultural system that produces enough food to support thousands also requires thousands to maintain it. You're locked in. The only direction is forward. More construction, more maintenance, more labor invested in infrastructure that fights entropy every single day. Next time you look at your apartment, your bedroom, wherever you're sitting right now, remember this. You're not looking at modern architecture. You're looking at Ali Nununun, Janjir Jan old compromise between what humans need and what the earth provides. The cave is still there. Dark, silent, unchanged. It was there before your species existed. It will be there long after. We're just not invited anymore.